Okay, so officially beginning the event now. Thank you. So thank you everyone for being here. We hope that this will be an interesting and important conversation, and we're very pleased to see you. I will just quickly give you an overview of what we expect this evening to be. Is that Emil? Oh, great, perfect. No, you're just in time. There's a train cancellation and microphone issues, but we're good. Please take a seat. Perfect timing. So, right, so the order of the evening will be thus. I will first do some introductions to the center, to the event, and to the speakers. And then we will go straight on to the session chaired by Professor Rita Floyd. And that session will have, the speakers here, whom I will introduce in a moment, and then Barry will respond to them. And then after that, you don't get a break just then, because this session flows into the next one, where I will be in conversation with Barry, and I will properly introduce everyone. Apologies for the informality at the moment. And then in that conversation, that would be followed by questions and answers. We're hoping that you ask about IR, but that you also ask about the scholar. If you're a scholar just setting out, the idea of this conversation, the second part of the session, is also for you to ask questions about the field, about how things look like from your perspective, and what you would want Barry to be thinking about and advising you on. All right, so that's the general stuff. Now, and after that we have a drinks reception. Now, properly to get started. So you're in 5E Hall. This university dates back to the 19th century. We are, this event is organized by CSD, Center for the Study of Democracy, which was set up in 1989 at a pivotal moment in, in global politics and history, as it were, as well. Professor Barry Buzan, Barry, is somebody who, this is sort of also like a return home, because at one point, Barry used to be an academic at the university and at CSD. So it's especially, the idea of celebrating his life, his work, his ideas is just so meaningful at multiple levels. CSD has a lot of events that we organize. If you just put the words CSD as the 3 alphabets and Westminster on Google, you should find our website as the first result. We're also on Twitter. What we pride ourselves in is addressing a whole range of critical, social, political, important challenges, and engaging with different kinds of actors, academia, scholars, media, activists, policymakers, and the diversity of ideas and events that we organize, so that it isn't a, you have to subscribe to this if that's what if you're at CSD. It's a whole range of ideas, and we're very proud of that diversity. I'm also very pleased not only to see lots of students and colleagues, but also 2 of our deputy vice chancellors, Professor Andrew Lin over there, and Professor Divyesh Anand over here, and also our head of School of Social Sciences, Alan Porter, who's over there. So yeah, so this is an important question, important conversation, and I'm so pleased to see everyone here. Now, I will introduce the panelists now, and I hesitated a moment there because I was thinking, you all know who Barry is, you all know who Professor Barry Buzan is, but nonetheless, I will read out his bio. Barry Buzan is Emeritus Professor of IR at the LSE. He was formerly the Montague Burton Professor there, Honorary Professor at Copenhagen, Jilin, and China Foreign Affairs Universities, and University of International Relations in Beijing, and Senior Fellow at LSE Ideas. In 1998, he was elected a Fellow of the British Academy. From 1999 to 2011, he was the General Coordinator of a project to reconvene the English School of International Relations. And from 2004 to 2008, he was the editor of the European Journal of International Relations. His recent books include, Barry is a prolific and amazing scholar. His recent books include, with Robert Faulkner, who's also here, the edited collection, Great Power, Responsibility and Global Environmental Politics in 2022, Making Global Society a Study of Humankind. I should have been wearing my glasses. Let me keep this somewhere. a little bit more light. Right. Great Power, Responsibility and Global Environmental Politics 2022, Making Global Society a Study of Humankind Across Three Eras 2023, with Robert Faulkner 2025, The Market and Global International Society, an English School Approach to International Political Economy. Timelines for Modernity, Rethinking Periodization for Global International Relations 2025 with Matthias Albert. The Anthropocene Crisis, a World System Science Approach, which is forthcoming in 2026. I'm also very privileged. I mean, Barry is an incredible collaborator, and I'm also very privileged to know him also as a co-author. Barry and I recently published earlier this year a piece on Trumpism and US politics in the British Journal of Politics and International Relations. And it's a testament to, to the wide range of things that Barry has worked on, which is what the panel will be discussing, the big picture approach, and why does it matter at a time when we're all forced into often narrow specializations. So that's Barry. And he's an incredibly generous scholar. Okay, Dr. Emil Akçali, Senior Lecturer in International Relations at the far end in the yellow coat. At King's College London has contributed to the discipline of IR for nearly 2 decades with research interests covering conflict studies, critical geopolitics, neoliberal governmentality, and global IR. Her work explores questions of power, security, and environment, providing perspectives that engage with and sometimes challenge established approaches in the field. Her research has been supported by various institutions, including the British Academy, the German Institute for International and Security Affairs, SWP, and the Foundation Robert Schuman. She has held resident fellowships at the Central European University Institute of Advanced Study and the A. Marseille University Institute of Advanced Study as a world-class scholar. Dr. Akçali is the author of a wonderful book, which without my glasses I can even read less of, Chypre, un enjeu géopolitique actuel, l'Harmattan, 2009. Her upcoming book, Turkey, Going Green, Navigating Ecology and Geopolitics, is scheduled for publication with Edinburgh University Press in 2026. Robert Faulkner, who's next to Emil, is Professor of International Relations at the London School of Economics and Political Science. His research and teaching focuses on international political economy, global environmental politics, and the role of business in international relations. His recent books include The Market and Global International Society, an English School Approach to International Political Economy, co-authored, OUP 2025, Great Powers, Climate Change and Global Environmental Responsibilities, co-edited OUP 2022, and Environmentalism and Global International Society, Cambridge University Press 2021. His new book on green political economy will be published by Polity in 2026. In case you're wondering that you've all got this, why am I reading this out? That's because the event is being recorded and people who are unable to be here it would be advantageous for them to have these details. Delighted to introduce Professor Rita Floyd in the center. Professor Rita Floyd has a PhD from the University of Warwick 2007. She's a professor of international security and ethics in the Department of Political Science and International Studies at the University of Birmingham and co-editor-in-chief of International Affairs. She is the author of numerous peer-reviewed articles and 4 monographs, including The Morality of Security, A Theory of Just Securitization 2019, and The Duty to Secure, from Just to Mandatory Securitization 2024, both published with the Cambridge University Press. Natasha Call, yours truly, who also, by the way, and I think this is important, happens to be the first professor in politics and IR at CSD at this university who is not a man. And in all of the decades. Is just going to also read out my bio for the record. MSc Econ Public Policy 98, PhD Economics Philosophy to 2003, University of Hull is a Professor of Politics, International Relations and Critical Interdisciplinary Studies, and Director of the Center for the Study of Democracy at the University of Westminster. A multidisciplinary scholar, her research covers economics, democracy, authoritarianism, gender, AI and technology, geopolitics, small states. She's the author of over 155 publications, including the monograph Imagining Economics Otherwise, Routledge 2007, Man Asian Literary Prize shortlisted novel Residue 2014, and peer-reviewed research across disciplines in various journals, including International Studies Review, Review of International Studies, the British Journal of Politics and IR, Analyses of Social Issues and Public Policy, Frontiers in International in Artificial Intelligence, International Relations of Asia-Pacific, in Indian Politics and Policy, Journal of Labor and Society, Cambridge Journal of Economics, Security Dialogue, Feminist Review, and Journal of Asian Studies. In other words, the big picture approach is really, really interesting to me. She's provided expert testimony on human rights at the US Congress and an expert report on transnational repression for the US Department of Justice. Her work and views have been featured in several hundred interviews across global media, including BBC, CNN, Financial Times, Washington Post, and the New York Times, and I'm on Twitter. Cornelia, I tried to do that as fast as possible. They say Abraham Lincoln spoke like 500 words per minute or something, trying to compete here. Okay, now slower. Cornelia Navari, who is our speaker here, has a BA from Columbia, MSc in Economics from London, PhD from Birmingham, was Associate Professor at the University of Birmingham and Visiting Professor at the University of Buckingham, UK. She's the author of The International Society Tradition, From Hugo Grotius to Hedley Bull, 2021, Public Intellectuals and International Affairs, Public Thinkers and Political Projects, 2013, and Internationalism and the State in the 20th Century, the year 2000. She has edited 19th Century America in the Society of States with Yanis A. Stivaktis, 2024, and International Organization in the Anarchical Society with Tony Brems Knudsen, 2019, among other edited volumes. She was named Distinguished Scholar by the English School section of the International Studies Association, or the ISA, in 2019. So, without further ado, I've saved Rita and the panel time for the introductions, which was kind of the idea, but over to you. Thank you.
Okay, well, thank you very much. I'm going to try and speak a little bit more slowly. First of all, Natasha, thank you so much for organizing this, and everybody else involved. Patrick, I can't see him right now, but I met him earlier, and other people involved, because it's a funny thing. When you do an edited book or a co-edited book, it's actually a lot of work. And along the way, you sort of think all the great things you can do when the book comes out. By the time the book has come out, you're completely exhausted, and you don't want to put an event on. You can't even imagine doing that because you're sort of still on the floor recovering from the process. And then somebody else comes along, as in this case, Natasha. Is it Natasha? Natasha. And also Robert later on in October, and offer to put this on for us, which is brilliant. So thank you very much indeed for this. So obviously, as I've already said, I'm the co-editor of this volume, and I'm going to use my time as a chair just a little bit to tell you how this book actually came about. And then also I'm going to say a little bit about my chapter in the book, which is separate from, obviously, the editor role. So the other editor is somebody called Laus Schoenborg. I'm terrible with saying people's names. So this is a man with far too many vowels in his name. So I can't actually spell it, and I can't say it either. But he certainly was instrumental to the book and getting the book underway. So I first met Barry in 2010, and I can't say I really knew him at all, really, in a sort of personal capacity, up until the writing of this book. But Laus is different. Laus did a PhD with Barry from 2007 to 2010. But whether you know someone, of course, personally doesn't really matter. What matters is, do you know their work? Does their work speak to you? And it's then a bonus if you get to know them and like them on top of that. And I'm sure that I'm not the only one here who's come to the topic they're interested in because of Barry. And I can say, when I was an undergraduate at the University of Portsmouth in 2000, I was interested in environmental security. I still am. It turned out to be quite a good topic to get into now with climate change. But I was interested in the environment, I should say. And I came to security studies partly because of Barry's work, because, it was someone who was able to explain, as I now call it, the big picture, the connections between things, but also this idea that there actually is potentially an environmental sector of security, that we can order things in that way, and it sort of managed to make this vast field just that little bit more accessible. And that, I think, is one of the major contributions. So from this impact and legacy really sort of came this idea to do something for Barry Buzan in the way of a Festschrift, and then nicely sort of tied in with his 80th birthday. I didn't really know what it was going to be, a Festschrift, which is this sort of German term, or a special section in a journal, or we didn't really know the format it would take. And so we quite quickly assembled a cast of people. Well, I initially went about doing that, and one of the people I did approach was Laus, because I had, talked to him about another project. And he was very helpful with that, and I realized, maybe actually he knows more about much of the parts of this book than I do, so perhaps he would want to come on board too. And, as I said, very luckily, he agreed. And we then sort of had this idea, well, maybe it should be a book, ideally a CUP book, which also, the publisher that has published, I think, most of Barry's work. And we approached John Haslam at CUP, and he said, well, yes, in principle I'm interested, but we don't publish Festschriften. We are not interested in people's beer stories. To which we basically thought, we think, people are possibly quite interested in those, and maybe Barry can share some of those later on, but it wouldn't do for a Cambridge book. There had to be something more specific to this book. It had to be a research project. And so Laus and I were brainstorming, what could this be about? And we were the whole time already quite clear on this. There is such a thing as a Barry book. We sort of knew, we know a Barry book when we see it. And this is how this idea came about. Initially, we were thinking, is it a sort of grand theory, this synthesizing of different approaches, this trying to order the world or a certain aspect of it. We couldn't quite put our finger on it. Initially, we went with, I think, grand theorizing, and we had a workshop with many of the contributors. And it wasn't too popular because, of course, there is a legacy attached to that term, which is not necessarily what Barry is doing. And from that, it eventually morphed into this idea of the big picture, which I think, you think you credit us with now, but actually it's in your work. I got this from an interview that you gave where you said, oh, I'm interested in the big picture. And I thought, yeah, the big picture, that's actually very good. Well, we write in these sort of acknowledgements, we write this tale up, how we got to where we ended up. So if you're interested in those kinds of stories, the acknowledgements are quite worthwhile reading. But anyway, so in the book then, in the introduction, Laus and I basically put forward what we think the big picture is. We identify a bunch of certain traits. We say it's the subjects of analysis are always large scale. It aims at simplifying and ordering hugely complex issues. It does not profess allegiance to one theoretical camp, which is why it's sort of different from grand theorizing. It takes a long-term view, stressing history. Sometimes it even looks into the future, and it is political and non-normative. So those are the traits. One other one is it has a fundamental sense-making quality in a way that it attempts to clarify certain concepts. But in the book, then we say, basically, this is our view, where it sort of comes across as a bit like a sort of a method, if you like, a certain way or an approach, but we say and deliberately encourage the contributors to not run with our idea what the big picture is, but to challenge it and to say, I think the big picture differently. Here's why, and there's some quite interesting contributions in the volume, what the big picture could actually potentially mean. So in the book, we divide it into 5 different parts, and those 5 parts come from where we think Barry has made the most contributions. So the first one is theory, so international relations theory. Then the second one is international society. I mean, it could have been the English school. Then we've got history, then security, and then the last one is IPE. And on the panel, we basically have representatives, well, we don't quite, but Emil has very kindly taken on the theory section. We haven't got anyone from the theory section here. Robert is one of the authors in the society section, so he will speak to that. And Cornelia will speak to the history section. Now, I have there's 2 chapters in the security tradition, and that is my chapter, and I thought I should just say, just very briefly, some of the things that have come out of that section. So the other chapter is authored by Thomas Dietz, and I think it's Emre Medili, a PhD. I think he was or is a PhD student of Thomas Dietz's. And I look at securitization theory, which is basically what I spent my life doing for some bizarre reason. And Thomas Dietz looks at regional security complex theory. And in a sense, I argue in the paper, or I make a little bit of the case for why Ole Wever and Barry Buzan have worked together so well through the medium of securitization theory. So by looking at different versions of securitization theory, I sort of end up saying that they have quite a similar view of what international relations theory is, that it is fundamentally tied to this idea of the international, which you also find in other people like Justin Rosenberg, for example. And that therefore you sort of almost end up with this big picture approach by default, because you have to take in the vastness of the international. But it's quite interesting that Thomas Dietz and his co-author, they don't actually really agree with that. I mean, they're not necessarily challenging what I say about securitization theory, but they think that the big picture can't really be top-down, but should be bottom-up, because only then do you take in nuances and everything in between and are truly able to offer a big picture approach. And they effectively end up advocating for regional security complexes from the bottom up. So it's quite radically different. So it's quite interesting how even within just 2 chapters, where people have the same brief, you can get quite a different view. So I leave you with that from me for now, and I will pass over to Robert.
Thank you very much, Rita. And before I start, I just want to commend the book to all of you. You should buy it and read it. It's a marvelous achievement to pull together this diverse group of scholars that have reflected on Barry's work, have critically engaged with it, and you come away just feeling enriched because there's a debate going on in the book. You really feel something happened in these conversations that have been had before. So well done, Rita, and Laus too is not here with us, of course. I should also say this is, I've once contributed to a German Festschrift, a proper one. My German professor at Munich University, where I studied, got one when he turned 65, 70. That was my one contribution to a Festschrift. I never thought I would contribute to a non-Festschrift. This is pretty much a non-Festschrift, because it started out as a Festschrift, but then became something altogether different. So yet again, Barry has broken new ground. I think this may be the world's only non-Festschrift in his name, which is in itself very interesting. I'm supposed to talk about international society and the English school, which I'll do, but in the instructions I got, I was told you could also make some personal comments. So if I may, I'll start with those. Because I have to say I count myself lucky that I joined the LSE back in 2002 at around the same time that Barry Buzan turned up at the LSE. I think we were separated perhaps by just a few months, if I'm not mistaken. That led to many years of very inspiring collaboration of an intellectual kind, a long-lasting friendship, which I value very much. Initially, I think our paths didn't cross very much. We worked together on EJAR when I joined your editorial team, and we were co-hosting the research seminar, but I was working in political economy. Barry made some noises about political economy, but English school wasn't very much high on my agenda. So it was only after Barry's retirement that we started to actually write together, which has led to a different kind of collaboration, which I found hugely, hugely enjoyable. Sometimes a bit stressful, Anyone who's worked with Barry knows that you're bound to be the one always behind the schedule. But you know, all good things come to an end. I don't think we will do any more books. My heart can't take it anymore. So I need a deep breather now at the moment. But there are 3 valuable lessons I've taken away from collaboration and writing with Barry. And I offer them to the audience, perhaps as general advice, take it or leave it, and make of it what you will. The first one is much more content-driven. It's only thanks to my work with Barry that I developed a much deeper appreciation of the potential that English school theory has as a grand theory of international relations. I think that just had escaped me before, and I did do my PhD working with Andrew Harrell, another great representative of the English school. I think it was my encounter with Barry's thinking that led me to appreciate the English school as a more general theory of international relations. The second point, again, took me a while to appreciate that. I'm now an avid mind mapper, also something I took from Barry. One of his, probably the most best-selling book is, of course, his co-authored book on mind mapping. And initially, when I saw that Barry uses mind maps for talks, for anything, I went home, told my wife, yeah, we've got this famous scholar who's joined us, but I'm a little worried. He has these colored maps in front of him. Surely this cannot go well in the long run. He uses color pens to mind map. Anyway, so I put this in the popular psychology section of my world order, and then gradually and determinedly, I became a devoted follower of your mind mapping strategy. I still use mind maps, particularly when it comes to the big picture, because there's no better way to organize thoughts and concepts on a big canvas when you're dealing with big topics. So I'm eternally grateful, Barry, for having taught me that. The third one is, of course, the obvious one. If you do big picture writing in international relations, and I think, Barry, you say this in the concluding chapter to the book, you say that it may actually be beneficial to do a lot of co-authorship. And I think there is something to it. Again, that made me reflect, preparing for the event today, that there is something about co-authorship when you tackle big topics. But what I've learned from Barry is, if you're a fast writer, you've got to have a lot of projects on the go where you co-author. Because when someone drops the ball, as I've done on so many occasions, Barry always said, don't worry, I've got many other co-authorships going at the moment. So you just take your time and send me your chapter when it comes. So those are my 3 personal takeaways. Take them and run with them if you think they might help you in your future work. Now, I know I need to speak about international society. And there are 2 chapters in the book, one by Filippo Costa Buranelli on the standard of civilization and mine on world society. I want to talk more generally about international society as a theme in Barry's work and the kind of big picture approach he's taken to it. It's, of course, the foundational concept for the English school. In some parts of the world, the English school is known as the international society tradition. From the beginning, international society, as many of you will know, was always thought of as one of the 3 master concepts of the English school. International system, world society, and international society sits in between. This is how Martin White dreamt it up. This is how it's become widely known. But the interesting thing about how the first generation of English school scholars thought about the international society is that, well, they were not always in agreement about how the 3 concepts were to be used, how they were related to each other. There was a lot of debate about shifting meanings, and I think that didn't quite help to give the English school that lasting impact that it should have had. There was much conceptual confusion about the meaning and the place of these 3 concepts and how they relate to each other. And that perhaps also explains why, as I arrived in the UK in the 1990s, just before Barry set upon reconvening the English school, I thought it was one of those quirky traditions that you either picked up or you didn't, and I didn't at that time. But then came Barry's 2004 book, From International to World Society, and for me, that was the aha moment in my engagement with it, because it stirred up a lot of debate within the English school, but what it did for me was it showed that there is big ambition and a big scope of theorizing engaged in this book. And that lifted the English school to a different level for me, because the bigness of that book that Barry wrote in 2004 that related to two dimensions of big picture thinking. One is the temporal dimension. By dissecting the different meanings of international society and world society, what Barry did was he showed that we can use these concepts to study the long-term evolution of societal patterns, societal structures in international relations. And we can do this across different historical periods. I'd never quite appreciated that the English school is not only time-bound, but also crossed and pan-temporal. And the second dimension that's big in this book is the spatial dimension. You can look at societal formations at different levels, from the regional level to the international to the global level. You can scale it up, you can scale it down. And having digested that book, I suddenly saw the English school as a kind of a theory of world historical development that it had never been in my mind before. It almost approached the status of a grand theory that we can use to expand the scope of all IR scholarship in these two scales, bigness, scalar bigness, and temporal bigness. And you see this then in the book's chapters on the international society. Buranelli focuses more narrowly on the standard of civilization, and he makes a similar argument about Barry's treatment of that concept, so central to English school thinking. But of course, that concept is very much rooted in 19th century thinking and 19th century international societal development. So Buranelli argues that what Barry has achieved is to develop a much grander narrative on stratification, on exclusion in international relations. He's allowed us to see the continuity in historical terms that exists between 19th century standards of civilization that perform a certain exclusionary role, and contemporary but also much older forms of inclusion-exclusion. And so again, we find here, as Buranelli shows, the value of a big picture approach that makes English school theory applicable to a much wider range of analytical interests, and indeed to a much wider range of theoretical traditions. As is appropriate for a non-Festschrift, Buranelli critiques your work for lacking normativity, but then again you set out to, I think, expel a little bit of normativity from English school theorizing, or at least separate it out from your more structuralist account, so nothing surprising there. And he argues that the role of capitalism was missing in your account of it, but then, yeah, I guess that goes for a lot of IR work in the English school, something that, in fact, Barry himself started to point out. And in my own work, and I don't want to dwell on this too much in my own chapter, I talk about how Barry rescued the world society concept from kind of marginalization in the discipline. A lot of people write about world society, but there's confusion about, is it a normative concept, is it a empirical concept? Barry, in my view, and that's what I took away from his work, very much pulled it out of the long-standing normative debate and made it a central concept for thinking through global structural phenomena and societal development. That, to me, was enormously productive in terms of thinking through the relationship between states and non-state actors, different issue areas, and so on and so forth. I point out in my chapter that actually in Barry's later writing, as he begins to transition to focus on global society as the main master concept, world society suddenly becomes an interim concept, a developmental stage towards a global society. And that's perhaps where my criticism comes in terms of perhaps losing again sight of the value of having established world society as that kind of master concept before. But again, different tastes, different concepts, different models, and I think nobody will ever accuse Barry of not trying hard to paint on an even bigger canvas as he has done with Making Global Society. It's a breathtaking work, and I didn't dare even pass comment on that. My final comment is on IPE. There are 3 chapters in the book. It's well worth thinking about this, that someone who's come from the security studies field, who's revitalized the English school, which of course has ignored IPE, political economy, from day one, has also called upon IPE scholars to engage with the English school. Barry made seminal contributions to that, and then we ended up writing a book together, which was enormously fun to do, but hopefully will provide perhaps a starting point for others to engage in that kind of exercise of bridging different disciplinary perspectives. I'm not sure the IP colleagues will really jump ship soon enough, because they've really gone down the hard way. The theory-based testing of empirical hypotheses. The American discipline of IP has firmly taken control of the IP narrative, but there's still this small island, this small corner in the world that's resisting, and perhaps, Barry, you've just added another fence to that, the fence of a more big picture IPE approach that has sadly gone missing in recent scholarship. So thank you, Barry, for leading us down so many interesting paths. We will never be able to follow you on all of them, but some of us have taken away a great deal of inspiration from that. No, I'm not a passionate gardener, unlike you, so I'll leave that to you. Thank you very much.
Okay, wonderful. Thank you, Robert. So, Cornelia, you up next?
Yes, on historical side of...
Want to stand, or did you?
I'm going to check that. It seemed to be giving a bit echo. How is it? Is it echo?
Yes.
Okay. Now, in this volume, we were encouraged to think not only with Barry, but beyond Barry. And one of the most fascinating parts of this volume is the way in which people have engaged with Barry and created new and really dynamic understandings on the basis of going beyond him. And I'm going to illustrate this in this historical section. I'm just going to take them chapter by chapter. There's Azara Coles. She presents Buzan's big picture theorizing as predominantly macro history. And she posits that macro history is essentially the jumping off point for theorizing into the 20th century. What does she mean by that? She has this very important argument in this book that it's not enough to dismantle existing grand narratives as being Euro or US centric. That's what we're into a lot these days. That's theorized by decentering. Okay. Nor is their alternative sufficient, which is arguing comparatively using 20th century analogies. Neither of these, she said, is a sufficient basis for understanding what is happening in the 21st century. Now, a wonderful part of this chapter is her account of the ahistoricism that America brought into the discipline and the development of methods without the need for theory. This is a very nice piece of disciplinary history in itself. She presents this as a cul-de-sac, and she says that the exit from this cul-de-sac is Buzan, is Barry, and his take on the English school with the help of American constructivism. Now that sounds like a little bizarre. We all know what constructivism. She points out the obvious in a way, when it's pointed out, that American constructivism, or the genealogy of ideas, opens the door to history. And that this particular vein of constructivism, the genealogy of ideas, merged with the historical vein in the English school, notably the expansion story, to make macro history immediately relevant. The Buzan take that she highlights, quite rightly in my view, is the concept of interaction capacity developed with Richard Little on systems in world history, his first great historical exploration that allows for the identification of historical systems outside the Westphalia model, expanding the pool for comparison and explanation. The second chapter, by Hamata Ataya, takes on Barry's functional approach and develops what an anthropologist understands by functions. Now, if you really want to understand functions, ask an anthropologist, because that's what they do. She points out first that his deep history mixes analytical tools from shallow times and that his primary institutions are not primary enough to cover the time span that he's treating. Accordingly, she reconstructs an anthropological history for a species-wide framework, noting that we, that is, the species to which we belong, that is, Homo sapiens, emerged not 1 million years ago, as posited by Buzan, but 200,000 years ago. And that is, she adjusts the periodization. The relevance of this will become evident a little later. For a species that was in evolutionary terms designed for the African tropics, focusing on global movements in that population between 200,000 years ago and 2,500 years ago, she adjusts accordingly Buzan's planetary conditions for human life and his humankind's material conditions for existence. Institutionally, she substitutes for science the more generic category of technology, science being one of those shallow institutions, a modern concept which you can't use transhistorically. Technology, she says, you use transhistorically. Among them, she notes buffering. That's the buffer between the individual and the society. So clothing, housing, product. Another one, connective institutions, language, communication. These are all generic categories that you can use transhistorically to compare different social orderings. Secondly, instead of inequality, social stratification. And third, religious institutions. With these in mind, she presents an integrative evolutionary framework of primary institutions in deep time. I love this thing. An evolutionary taxonomy of institutions. Table 8.1. And I advise anyone who's interested in functional analysis transhistorically to look at table 8.1. It begins with basic ordering principles, for example, for early man, foraging, and then agrarian. Secondly, basic requirements understood functionally, management, skill, resources. Then primordial institutions, associative domains that had to evolve, technology, religion, exchange, reproduction. And only then, Buzan's redrawn primary and secondary institutions which enable the primary institutions. It is a grand schema which really allows you to do a real, to identify different functions of different institutions across a universe of different time-based social organizations. My own chapter follows closely on the preceding two and distinguishes the two main forms of macro history. That is, world history and synthetic history. World history is the study of the human past on a global scale to identify cross-cultural connections, paying attention to fusion and melding between different social, political, and economic environments. Synthesis is the identification of a relevant socio-economic or political dynamic within a particular periodization and the agents who affect it. Barry has produced, in 2 cases with colleagues, major works in each field and admixtures of both. The first I've already alluded to, Systems in History, with Richard Little, eschewing Westphalian political categories for a really brilliant transhistorical category, that of interaction capacity, across different fields, or as Hamati Ataya would say, realms. The 3 realms: political, military, economic, social, cultural. Considered synthetically, the work identifies the critical dynamic of trade in creating systems and the role of traders in the classic period as historical agents, those that move the dynamic along. The second big exercise, The Great Transformation with George Lawson, follows on. It's a purer form of synthetic history, identifying as the historical subject this time the transformation of the European system between the end of the 17th century and the beginning of the 20th century. The dynamic is the 4 revolutions of modernity: nationalism, bureaucratic centralization, the shift from trade to production, the application of industrialization to war. The historical agents are the rising industrial powers, Britain first, then Germany, America, and Japan. This book was received with just acclaim, considered to be obvious when you understood that it was obvious, that this was a great transformation between the pre-modern and the modern. The third is evolutionary study of the world system to the present deep pluralism. This is a dystopia of divided sovereignty between a growing core and a diminishing periphery, marked by uneven development with profound cultural, political, and economic differentiation. The dynamic is up for grabs. There are so many factors at play in this great development. But I would choose the social cultural domain, and within that domain, European positive law, in a fusion with the move from trade to production. As for a possible social agent, not identified by Buzan, but in terms of what he's describing, I would suggest the dynastic monarchs who drove the European system into trade colonialism, globalizing European competition and driving the first stages of globalization. The process of which, by the way, are ably described by John Hobson in his IPE chapter. Now, engaging with Buzan's macro histories will instruct any rising macro historian as to the requirements of his trade. Is it an evolutionary story you want to tell, or an intentional synthetic story? In either case, what is the historical subject, or system in Buzan terms? And what is the periodization? Is it a global story from the beginning of time? So we choose Homo sapiens. Is it a specific historical transformation of empire? Let's choose 1765. What are the realms of change? Is it primarily military political, for example, Napoleon? Is it economic, for example, the difference between foraging and agrarian? Or is it social cultural, for example, free trade versus mercantilism? If you're going for synthesis, who are the drivers of change? Are they traders? Are they dynasts, industrializing powers? You can quarrel with Buzan's periodizations and his preference for structure over agent, but not with his understanding of the realms of change, and not with the need to identify ab initio the system or the historical subject. This is absolute central to writing macro history, and he's brought it out in absolute full force. My own engagement with Barry is not really so much in the macro side, actually, but in the more middle range side, which is, of course, 2004 and secondary institutions, the distinction between primary and secondary institutions. This was absolutely enlightening bolt from the blue. Why was this important? This is the kind of thing that Barry does for you, because he suddenly gave an empirical foundation to Hedley Bull's massively under-theorized international institutions. You could suddenly see with secondary institutions where the primary institutions were located. And you could begin to then compare them, analyze them, see what happened to them. That was my great gift from Barry Buzan.
Thank you very much, Cornelia. So, Emel, you are next.
All right, can you hear me? All right, okay, thank you. Thank you for the invitation. Thank you for the suggestion, Barry. No, you cannot. Just this one? Does it work? Yeah. Does it work now? Yeah. All right, okay, great, okay. So thank you, Rita, as well, for giving me this theory chapter. I really enjoyed it. And I did old school, so I took notes in my little notebook. And I'm really interested in what Barry is going to say here, because there's a really nice conversation, and I wonder, and also with the editors in this section. So I'm really curious what you have, how you will respond to these as well. I have a few personal stories and how Barry's work has influenced my work, but I will leave them to the end. So I also have a hard time pronouncing last names, so I will say just editors of the book, if it's okay, when I talk about how you saw the big picture. So I think the big picture, according to the editors of this book, is a research approach. It is different from a ground theory like Waltzian neorealism and from Marxism and postmodernism, and emphasizing that Buzan offers frameworks for how to study rather than a substantive theory of IR. So Le Weaver, the first author of this book in the theory chapter section, and also a long-time collaborator of Professor Buzan, offers more critical and a nuanced conceptualization. So he sees the big picture not as a Waltzian picture, mentally formed, tied, minimal, and also causal structure, but as a complex conceptual map, so akin to mind mapping. Big picture is co-produced also with its object, global society's historical evolution. It does not stand apart from reality. It lacks a tight causal core. Instead, it offers many concepts from English school, neorealism, and historical sociology, without predefined relationships. Weber suggests there might be a theoretical core here, a hidden theoretical core, so the interaction of three domains, interpolicy, transnational, and interhuman, with primary institutions and their degree of interlocking coherence. He contrasts his own preference for small focused, just theoretical nuggets in his own words, so securitization, with Buzan's elaborate many-dimensional schemes. Weaver also highlights a key methodological implication. Buzan is not trying to formulate general principles that apply to eras as comparative cases. Instead, the big picture widens our understanding of what can happen. It explores different pathways, such as how primary institutions evolve across domains, and this makes the big picture a heuristic for possibility, not a predictive or law-like theory. Weaver thus conceptualizes it as a mapping device that gives priority to contingency and variation over generalization, and I think that I quite like this approach. So moving to Matthias Albert and his chapter on the big picture as a goodbye to international relations, I went back to my postdoctoral years because Matthias Albert, I used to read him a lot, and he's deep, he's very into theory. So it was I found this chapter a bit difficult, but I really enjoyed it. So Albert does not define the big picture as theory, per se, as a method or theory per se. Instead, he uses the term to describe Buzan's intellectual trajectory away from the international as a collective singular. For Albert, the big picture is what emerges when one stops taking the international for granted as a timeless universal frame. He conceptualizes Buzan's move as from international systems in world history, still operating within the departicularized international, towards making global society, escaping the gravitational pull of the international and entering interstellar beyond disciplinary space. So thus the big picture here is a critical, denaturalizing perspective that reparticularizes the international and opens up truly global historical analysis. Hence, the big picture is a critical, denaturalizing intellectual move, escaping the international collective singular. Finally, John Williams' chapter on big picture ethics and why normativity is unavoidable in the big picture, and this one I think I feel the closest to. Williams also fundamentally challenges the editor's claim of non-normativity of the big picture. So the big picture is conceptualized as inescapably normative because, and I strongly agree with Professor Williams here, methodologically choices about epistemology, whose perspective matters, analytical framing, what questions to ask, and treatment of ethical debates are inherently ethical. Analytically, long-term structural dynamics cannot be understood without acknowledging their normative content. So social actors debate normative concepts, progress, justice, equality, and liberty that shape structural change. So Williams proposes counterpoint as a methodological metaphor, interviewing distinguishable harmonic lines, social structural analysis, and normative reflection to achieve a result greater than the sum of the parts. He argues that Buzan's attempt at normative agnosticism is both impossible and analytically costly. So I will go back to this, so I'm really interested in what Buzan will say about this and whether he sees the big pictures as apolitical, as it has been suggested. So how do I view this big picture? Is the method, theory, or something else? And just looking at all the authors, the three authors on theory and also the editors, I think I see this big picture as a multidimensional intellectual practice that cannot be reduced to a single category. So it contains elements of heuristic framework, as it's been evoked by the editors. It organizes complexity and clarifies concepts. And according to Weber, it's a mapping device, a network of concepts without tight causal structure. And its value is exploring possibilities and not generating laws. According to Albert, it is a critical move. So it denaturalizes the international as a collective singular. And Williams, as I said, this says the big picture has a normative stance and then reflects intellectual traditions with embedded ethical commitments. As I said, I also depart from the claim that the big picture is apolitical because choices about what constitutes a big question or a relevant pattern are normative for me. So the big picture, for me, is better understood as a normatively saturated analytical sensibility that aims for scope and recognition, while inevitably reflecting the theory's ethical and epistemological commitments. It is not a theory in Wallsian sense, no causal laws, no testable hypotheses. It is partly a method, mind mapping, illustrative examples, but it is more than a method because it carries implicit worldviews. So I think it is best called a macro-analytical research framework with unavoidable normative dimensions. And that's what I will try to also here. I will be looking forward to Barry's answers to that. And one question was how easy or hard is it to do this big picture, this research, and also I think for young scholars here, they would be curious to find out about this as well. So all authors agree, very hard, but for different reasons. So for the editors, it's hard because it requires deep knowledge, generalist skills, and cognitive tools like mind mapping. For Weber, it is extremely hard, perhaps unique to Buzan. Comparing errors is not about applying general principles, so the researcher cannot rely on standard comparative case methodology. One must instead trace different pathways without fixing units or wholes, and that is methodologically demanding and requires constant reflexivity to avoid reductionism or essentialism. And for Albert, it remains focused on disciplinary difficulty. So escaping the gravitational pull of the international as collective singular requires overcoming institutional inertia in international relations. As for the normative critique of Williams, there is a different kind of difficulty, unethical and reflexive, that makes big picture research not just cognitively hard, but ethically hard. It demands a rare combination of empirical breadth, theoretical sophistication, historical self-awareness, and normative courage. Once again, I side with Williams. The very act of choosing to tell the story of humankind from a particular vantage point using particular concepts and privileging certain patterns such as alignment, coherence, and order over others is a normative exercise. And Weber's observation that Buzan's theory co-evolves with the object only reinforces this. The big picture is not a neutral lens, but a co-production between the theories and the world. Thus, the big picture is hard to do not only because it demands immense empirical work and disciplinary boundary crossing, but it demands ethical reflexivity without falling into relativism. And the big picture is neither a method nor a theory, but a normatively charged heuristic mapping practice. That is rare, as it is valuable, and perhaps, as Weber suggests, uniquely achievable by a scholar like Buzan. So have I adopted this way of doing research in my own work? Very honestly, thus far, I have not adopted Buzan's big picture approach. And not because I reject it, I admire it greatly, but because my intellectual formation, skills, intellectual concerns, and research questions have pulled me elsewhere. So I have a BA and MA in international relations, but a PhD in political geography from continental Europe, hence the book in French. So PhD in geography, political geography from Sorbonne. So I have thus far thought in terms of place, territory, identity, material flows, and situated knowledge. So longue durée institutional mapping that Buzan does so brilliantly has not been my natural habitat thus far. But this is the critical point that Zara Cole helps us to see. So I actually read Zara Cole's piece because I was really interested in what she has to say. Because what I understood from there as well, I do not need to adapt Buzan's big picture in order to be influenced by it. Buzan's achievement is not to create a template that everyone must copy, and this achievement is to legitimate a macro-historical ethos in IR. So he made it possible for scholars like me working on non-Western agency, global IR, to ask big historical questions without being dismissed as unscientific or unsystematic. He built bridges between mainstream theories, the English school, and global IR. The bridge is now available for all of us to cross, even if we cross it in our own way and to our old destinations. So I can say that I have entered the intellectual space that Buzan helped open, and that is Buzan's gift, not a method to be replicated, but a permission to think big or bigger. So just a few things about how I have come across with Buzan. This is interesting because I was a postdoctoral fellow in Birmingham years ago, just after, that was when I left France and came to the UK, and Thomas Dietz was my mentor. So at that time was the heyday of securitization theory. So that was like, as if Buzan's somewhere, just this mystical figure who has just give form to these fantastic, brilliant scholars like Thomas Dietz and Lena Hansen, and so there were a lot of discussion about that. So that was, I think, the most intellectual encounter. And then again, when I was a PhD student, I came to a conference in London, the Geography Conference, the Royal Geographical Conference, and then Buzan was there, I think it was in 2007, to tell us how to get published, actually, in, I think in international relations. So I followed his advice and started to get published, so I'm very thankful for all that, but there was just one advice that I didn't follow. That was, I don't know if you remember, Barry, but you said that don't ever publish with your partner. There. So I was, and then I did publish. And it really got published that Nature Knows No Boundaries in one of the best journals of geography. But that was the beginning of the end of that relationship. So I was unable to see the big picture. So that was just them. So and then 20 years later, I'm a senior lecturer at King's College, and coincidentally, and by coincidence, we met at a dinner party, and this was like a Sherlock Holmes style dinner party. Nobody really knew why we are there and who these people are or whatever. And then all of a sudden, we see, we are more, junior scholars, and we see Barry Buzan, he's a celebrity, and he's also there. So, and then I had this idea to invite him to the defense departments, because I'm kind of a different figure. I mean, I joined the defense department of King's College London a few years ago, and I teach about critical geopolitics, critical security studies, the environment, and all these things that are not traditionally taught there. And as in a non-British woman academic teaching all this stuff, that I am different. But by inviting Barry to come and speak at our Defense Academy in Shirvenham, and because the MOD, all these content, the teaching content is all about Barry Buzan, is all about securitization. And then he came to speak to us last September, and since then I think I have been normalized, rehabilitated. So that was a payoff after 20 years, I guess. So that was the small personal anecdotes. And since then, we are in conversation about, I think mostly about global IR and non-Western and Western, maybe a dichotomy of looking at international relations. Thank you.
Well, Thank you very much, Emil. I mean, this is interesting for me as well, what you have to say about the chapters, because it's in a sense the asset test. You know, you're not part of the book, so you don't have a stake in it, you don't feel you have to defend it. But it made sense to you, and you liked it, so that's good. So on that note, I'm going to hand over to you, Barry.
Okay, is this working? No.
No, it's not on.
Okay, can you hear me in the back? Okay. Well, thanks to everybody for all of these comments. Thanks in particular to Rita and Laust for getting the big picture book done. No? Any better? Oh, yes. Okay. Yeah. Thanks to Rita and Laust for getting the big picture book done. I know it wasn't easy, and it was an absolutely wonderful 80th birthday present, and you delivered it bang on time, so it was kind of, became part of that whole event in my life, which was great, and still is, so it will go on and on until later this summer. I know you had some struggle with the kind of attitudes at Cambridge that they didn't want to do a Festschrift, and that kind of leads me as a first comment to wonder, why is British academic culture so hostile to the idea of a Festschrift? Because they clearly are, whereas the continental cultures, Germany, Denmark, others, the Festschrift is a well-established thing in their academic culture. So there might be something there worth reflecting on about, why this rather poverty-stricken attitude of celebrating one's colleagues in British academia. Is there something particularly nasty about our culture? I'm not sure, but it's just an interesting point to reflect on. I'm going to continue by making a few general points, some of which apply to more than one of what the speakers have said. There's no particular order to them. They are simply some observations that I've picked up from what's being said along the way. I'm intrigued by Rita's story that the big picture came originally from me, which kind of implies things are going around in circles, because when you and Laust first put that to me, must have been, 5 years ago now, it came to me as a revelation. So I was unaware I'd had this thought earlier on apparently about myself. And I'd been playing to this idea ever since they raised it, because it seemed to me it made sense of what I was doing in a way that I hadn't thought of before. So I'm grateful to you for that as well. Mind mapping has been mentioned once or twice, and yeah, I have found this generally a good tool for big picture thinking. Most of you, anybody here never heard of mind mapping? Okay, that's the normal response. Everybody has heard of mind mapping in one way or another. It's a good way of doing this kind of thinking, because it forces you to focus on something in the middle, but allows you to think completely randomly and non-linearly around that. So it's a very nice, comfortable method for that. In terms of the security theory side of things, just a small footnote to the literature that's been discussed here. Securitization was Ola's idea, and then I kind of picked up on that because he and I were working together at that time. But that's his theory. My contribution to what became known as the Copenhagen School was the idea of sectors and the idea of regional security complex theory. And in the mid-90s, Ola and I kind of started writing a book which was going to combine all of those things, right? But this turned into a ridiculously long book, even by my standards. And so it got broken up into a variety of books, particularly the securitization book in '98, which if we had written it with more foresight that that was going to be a freestanding book, his name would have gone first, because securitization theory is his. And then the 2003 book on regional security complex theory. So that's just a peculiarity of the way in which the thinking unfolded at the time and the way it manifested itself in different books, which started out not being thought of as different books, but became different books along the way. I might also say a little bit about how I came to the English school, because it relates to the parts of the story already told. I would have been hard put to tell you what the English school was until sometime in the late 1980s. I was never taught the English school when I was an undergraduate or even a master's student. I had been told to read Hedley Bull, but Hedley Bull was just another author. He wasn't identified as part of an English school. So I had no idea about the English school at all. Until sometime during the mid to late 1980s. The people who basically opened my eyes to it were, interestingly, Ole Weber, who was not English school himself, but was quite interested in it and knew the literature quite well. One of the amazing things about Ole, when I started working with him, which was although he was quite a bit younger than me, he seemed to have read everything I'd read, plus hundreds of other things that I hadn't read. So he was great to talk to, because he had this huge breadth. And he was keen on it, and so was Richard Little, with whom I was working in other ways. And for me, the English school provided my way out of neorealism, which had kind of preoccupied me during the 1970s and 1980s, and which I was getting bored with, but couldn't quite see the way out. And the English school, for me, was the passage out of that kind of narrow. You know, I'm very glad I had engaged with Waltz and neorealism, but I'm also glad not to have got stuck there. Okay. Yeah, the question of the division, partly in the context of the English school and partly just generally in IR, between structural and normative thinking. This is a question that has exercised a lot of people on the grounds that I don't seem to be particularly interested in doing normative thinking. And that's sometimes held against me as a fault, or sometimes I'm given credit for it. I don't see either of those positions as being particularly relevant. I just see it as a division of labor. Okay. Some people prefer to think about the normative side of questions, and some people prefer to think about the structural side of questions. And these two things play into each other. They kind of need each other. So I feel my contribution to the normative debate is to make them clearer by setting out what the structural, what's at stake structurally in all this. So I sometimes describe myself as, or what I do in the English school, as not doing normative theory, but doing theory about norms. So I don't feel in the slightest bit uncomfortable about the position I'm in here, or I don't feel any contradictions with it. That just may indicate the limits of my self-perception and self-understanding, but that's the way I've always seen it. Then, the question of thinking beyond Barry, which was nicely put in the book. This is, of course, something I, by definition, cannot do. But I can expanding. Well, I can expand the domain of what Barry thinking means, and that's in a sense what I've been doing. I think for me in the book, the chapter that made the biggest impact in this respect was in Anna's one, which you mentioned, Cornelia. I mean, that when I read that, that struck me as the absolute exemplar of how to make the big picture even bigger, in the sense that it extended back, way back in time, the sorts of things I had been thinking about in rather vague and not tremendously well-informed ways, but she pushed it back, and yet it all made sense in relation to the kinds of things I had actually been thinking about. So suddenly there was a huge temporal expansion in the scope of the particular big picture that I was playing with. And that the big picture can always be bigger, I think is one thing to say about it. And it's, if you're minded to think in that way, it's tremendous fun, because you do get a sense, however misguided, you do get a sense of being able to understand in some way and see in some way the whole of what's going on. And to me, at least, that's a very satisfying, very entertaining thing to do. I think I had the first experience of it when Richard Little and I were working on what became that book in 2000 of International Systems in World History. So there was a eureka point which happened to me in Göteborg in Sweden for some reason, where I first got the feeling, damn, I can tell the whole story from the year dot to now and make sense of it. And I had never been able to do that before. So there's a kind of transcendental moment when you shift from an archipelagic knowledge of things, where you know things about islands that are separately located in time and space, but you may not know too much about what connects those islands together. But if you read enough and work hard enough, at some point you get that eureka moment where you think, yes, I have a coherent story, which I can connect all of these things together, even if it's at a quite high level of abstraction. So where to next? On Cornelia's point about historians, I may be wrong about this, but I don't see myself as a historian of any kind. I did study history for a time, so I was introduced to it as a discipline, but I have never obeyed the kind of historiographical rules that you have to obey in order to be a proper historian. I think when you're doing world history, you almost can't obey those rules. So there's a kind of contradiction within history about that. But what I have tried to do is to take the narrative storytelling style of history and move it up in degrees of abstraction. So historians tend to tell you who's doing what to whom, when, where, and why, in some particular time and space. What I've tried to do is to use the English school structure, use the kind of structure, primary institutions, the structure of society, to be, as it were, the players or the actors or the pieces in that kind of historical narrative. So I'm trying to adopt the historian's narrative storytelling style, but not at the same level as historians do it. I don't know what you would call this, but I don't see it as being history in that sense. Yeah, I think in terms of how to study, what Emil was saying, perhaps one response to what you've said is that I have partly unconsciously and partly consciously spent my life avoiding being associated with any discipline. Okay? So for me, international relations was attractive because it started off, in the way it was taught to me initially as an undergraduate, it was a not very good joint degree between history and political science. The historians and the political scientists had not spoken to each other about this, they just taught their own angles on it. So you've got a bit of world history and a bit of political science type stuff. So I've ridden with that. I've always taken the view that I think international relations is a discipline, but it's not a discipline like most other disciplines. In other words, most of the other disciplines in the social sciences are defined by some particular kind of behavior, economics, right, or politics, or sociology, law. International relations isn't defined in that way. To me, it's defined as being, it's defined by scale. Right? It's the big side of everything. It's the big side of all of the social sciences and the big side of history. And therefore, if you're doing international relations, you can basically do what you like. Right? So you can pick and choose and move around and not be constrained by any particular discipline. So I kind of started off that way by accident, liked it, and have gone down that line ever since. The question you ask, is the big picture political? I think it is. I'm only going to say one thing about this, which I think the big picture is the key to doing grand narratives. Right? So if you want to do grand narratives, you need to do big picture research. And unfashionable though it may be in the social sciences, I'm full on in favor of grand narratives. Right? It seems to me that one of the biggest mistakes made in the social sciences over the last decades was dismissing grand narratives as being something awful that you shouldn't do, just rejecting the idea. That completely cripples any kind of political leverage that you might have, because politics is a game of grand narratives. Who can tell the best story and the most compelling and convincing story? Right? That's basically what politics is about. Now, I don't think of what I do as being particularly political because it's at too high a level of abstraction to get any attention from the political classes who have better things to do than think about high levels of abstraction. I mean, they're basically working with whatever intellectual portfolio they graduated with and trying to make the best of that. But it does seem to me that it was an enormous mistake that a lot of people made. I mean, feminists, perhaps most obviously, rejected this completely. And this just seemed to me to cripple their political campaign. So in my humble view, grand narratives is a game you should be in if you want to be political. You have to be in it if you want to be political. And the objective is to win, right? Is to provide a better grand narrative and a more compelling one than what else is out there. And that's quite good fun if you want to engage in that sort of game. And since I'm out of time, the last thing I'll say is that I don't think of there being any kind of zero-sum game or antagonism between specialists and generalists, or big picture people and specialists. I mean, you need each other. I couldn't do what I do unless I read the work of lots of specialists. And a lot of specialists find that they benefit from reading a bit of big picture work because it puts their stuff into context. So this is an interdependent relationship and not something that needs to be worried about. It sounds as if on the don't ever publish with your partner, I should rest my case here from what you said. But I think the motive behind what I was saying there was what then does your your daily private life look like? You have no escape from work if you write with your partner. What on earth is the dinner table conversation about? No. Okay, so maybe we just agree to differ on that. But anyway, thank you very much for all of the observations, and that's my bit.